It's River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer. Some 220 years after Meriwether Lewis and William Clark stumbled back into St. Louis with an incredible story to tell, a new book argues that story was never really just about two men at all. The new book, This Vast Enterprise, rebuilds the Lewis and Clark expedition from the ground up, rotating the point of view chapter by chapter among the people who made it possible. Among them, the enslaved man named York, enslaved, a servant of Clark. He found ways to exercise his power. We'll talk about him. The Shoshone teenager, Sacagawea, we know that name. A hard-drinking working-class sergeant we don't really know the name of until now, John Ordway. He towed the expedition's barge and fought off grizzlies. Of course, Thomas Jefferson, maneuvering through bitter partisan politics to fund the whole vast enterprise in the first place, but also the Lakota leader, Black Buffalo, upending everything we thought we knew about diplomacy on the Missouri, and a Blackfoot teenager named Wolf Calf, whose long-buried account of a deadly clash with Lewis directly contradicts Lewis's own journal. My guest spent 5 years working on the book, digging into more than 30 archives, conducting over 100 interviews to chase this story down, including a college notebook that proves William Clark was actually a serious student of the Enlightenment. Craig Fehrman is a journalist and a historian. His first book, Author-in-Chief, was called one of the best books on the American presidency in years. His latest book, This Vast Enterprise, is a New York Times bestseller and the front cover pick of the New York Times Book Review. Craig Fehrman, welcome to River.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Let me start off by this, and I listed a lot of things there. I'm so excited about this book. I hope we have enough time to get to most of them. I can't promise all of them because there's so much there. I want to start off by asking you, at what point in reading through these journals, by your account, I think 1 million words from different hands, did you realize this was always an ensemble story, not just a two-man show here?
Well, it was a really small detail, but it was a very human detail. And I kind of think that's how I built this book, detail by detail and human by human. And it actually, the detail was before the expedition even started. It was in that first winter, 1803 to 1804, when they're just kind of hanging out outside of St. Louis and sort of getting ready for the big journey ahead of them. And it was about York, the black man that you mentioned. And Clark just has this throwaway sentence where he says, York commenced sawing with a whipsaw. And I remember reading this journal, and this is when I was sort of still thinking, do we need a new book about Lewis and Clark? Is there something new here to say? And so, I'm a skeptic. I'm a journalist, so I got to convince myself before I can convince anyone else. And that sentence about a whipsaw, I just sort of started putting pressure on it, digging into it, thinking about it. What's a whipsaw? Well, it's a very important tool in this time period. It's a very difficult tool to use well. It's how you turn logs into planks. And they're building their winter quarters. The hail and the snow is coming down. They need these planks. So it's a difficult tool in a very time-sensitive situation. Why did they pick York? There were dozens of white soldiers Lewis and Clark could have chosen instead. They picked York because he was the best man for the job, because he had a lot of experience with these sorts of tools, being an enslaved man in Kentucky. And so from this one detail, this line about a whipsaw, you can start to see York's contributions. You can start to see how York is distancing himself from his owner. You can start to see how this complicated story always involved lots of people and lots of perspectives. And I found details like the whipsaw again and again in the journals, and the problem switched from being, do we need a new book to how do we bring all these details together to tell the story in a new way?
Well, York is a good place to jump in. Let's do that, because this is the enslaved servant of Clark, who really interesting. I think he appears in more chapters from his own point of view than anyone else in your book. 100 times in the expedition's journals, I think I read. But he couldn't read or write himself. Do you have a reading there you can share a little bit about York from your book, so we can get a chance to sample your prose and get a sense of York?
Sure. And so just to set this up, this is when about, in that first year when Lewis and Clark are meeting with the Arikara, which is one of the native nations that they dealt with a lot. And York it's the second day of meeting with them. On the first day, the Arikara have been astonished by York because they had never met anybody with black skin before. And so York had met with them. And then sort of the second day is happening. Lewis and Clark are worried about negotiations and diplomacy, but the Arikara are mostly worried about York. So I'll read to you a passage from there. That second day featured more feats of strength and inspections of skin, from York's face down to his feet. He added something new for the many native children in the attendance. With the help of a translator, York began to tell silly stories, that he had grown up as a wild bear, that he liked eating people, and that small people were the tastiest of all. The children loved it, especially when he pretended to roar, and the families continued to flock. John Ordway noted in his journal their, quote, most friendly manner. And yet later, when someone told Clark about York's stories, his response was irritation. My black servant, Clark wrote, made himself more terrible in their view than I wished him to do. In terms of the expedition, Clark's criticisms made little sense. The expedition was leaving soon and needed good news. York's popularity seemed like an easy win for American cultural diplomacy. In terms of the psychology of slavery, though, Clark's criticisms made all the sense in the world. York had done something on his own, without his owner's direction, and he was earning attention and praise. This ate at Clark. It inflamed his jealousy, his desire for dominance. The more the slave stood out, the more the owner seethed.
Craig Fehrman, reading from his book, This Vast Enterprise, A New History of Lewis and Clark. Let's linger there with York for just a moment, because I found this so fascinating. Also humorous with the bear, if you can picture him playing a bear there. And interesting, too, that as they move west, Clark is really quite the centerpiece of attraction for the native tribes until you get to the West Coast, where they have seen African Americans or Africans before, right? But with your example of the bear and the reading there, we see that York is exercising a little bit of power, and Clark is not really a fan of it at first. What kind of power is actually possible for an enslaved man to exercise on this expedition? What did we learn? What did you learn?
Well, what's interesting is that it's not as much power as Clark had, of course, but it's more power than York had when he was in St. Louis or when he was in Louisville. The further they got outside of American society, the more the expedition had to sort of rewrite the rules, because they were kind of a little traveling society of their own. And so Clark did not like what York was doing. He thought York was overdoing it. Like I said in my passage, I think psychologically Clark was frankly jealous. But York kept doing it. This was a time where Clark, could say, I don't want you to do that. And York could say, you know what, I'm going to push these boundaries because what I'm doing is valuable to the expedition, but also because I'm having fun. That passage is built around details from the journals because, like you said, York could not read or write. But if you look at those details carefully, and if you look at those details from York's point of view, you can see that he's having fun. I don't think that it's necessarily that this attention helped York think of himself differently. I think if you read the writings of black people from this time period, people like Phyllis Wheatley, you understand that black people in this time period already understood and took for granted their full humanity. But what did change for York is he was able to see that I can sort of, exercise that humanity. Just because Clark says don't do this, the rules are a little different here. I enjoy doing this. I want to do this. I can push against those boundaries, even if those boundaries, of course, were still very real and very much in place.
And after the expedition here, to jump forward in the narrative about York here, Clark wrote that he didn't agree, despite all these really Herculean tasks. He was a great oarsman, navigating the boats. Not all of them were, but he wrote that he didn't agree York had earned his freedom. Talk about that moment, because that is something to view out of 21st century eyes, isn't it?
That's right. In a letter to his brother, Clark wrote, I do not agree with York that his immense services have earned his freedom. And I think that's a letter, like so many documents with the expedition, that we can read in two ways. If you read it from Clark's point of view, immense services, that's a sarcastic line, right? Like he's sort of throwing it in scare quotes. But I also think we can hear York's voice in that too, because clearly from Clark's letter, York was arguing, I was there every step of the way. I did everything that you did. I sacrificed everything. I've earned my freedom. Given what I gave to the expedition, I should be free. And so that case makes a lot of sense. I went back and crunched the numbers, and just in terms of raw financial statistics and what a skilled slave was worth in this time period, York had absolutely earned his freedom. There's no question about it. But earning your freedom isn't the same as getting your freedom. These are the boundaries we were talking about. And so in the end, it was Clark's choice, and Clark chose for many years after not to free York. It's a really heartbreaking ending to a story that in many places is heartwarming.
Yeah, and an interesting footnote here that you make in the book, well, actually in the reading of the book, that that York was Clark's possession, and as such, this was a military venture, that Clark was compensated for feeding and clothing York, right, by the military.
That's right, and this is one of these twisted and bitter ironies that is hard to understand from today's point of view, which is why, in my book, I tried to say what was life like in 1804, and readers are smart. They can grapple with this themselves. But the irony is that Clark was the one who got paid for York. People sometimes ask me, well, did York get paid? Yeah, he got paid about $7 a month, but that money went straight to Clark because it was for the wear and tear on his property. Of course, this irony just unfolds in so many different ways. York was eating things, but he was often eating buffalo that York himself had shot. York was very valuable. He was creating value in addition to just being a human being who deserved freedom and autonomy. But in this time period, in this system, all the money, all the credit would flow to Clark. It's just so fascinating that York found ways to sort of express his immense services, to, again, use that double-sided phrase.
Craig, we have to take a break in a moment. Let's linger with Clark here a little bit, because we want to get into the Iowa connections in your vast book, this vast enterprise. We have just moments here in this hour, really, to talk about a few of the highlights, especially from an Iowa point of view. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about moving up the Missouri with what's now Iowa on one bank, and covering the expedition's very first formal council with Native leaders near what became known as Council Bluff. This was the first of the councils on this trip, and people are saying, what are councils anyway? Where did Council Bluff get its name? We'll find that out when we come back. Historian Craig Fehrman, his new book, This Vast Enterprise, A New History of Lewis and Clark, 5 years, 30 archives, 100 interviews, and an expedition retold from 10 different points of view. Stay tuned. We'll be back after a short break. I'm Ben Kiefer. It's River to River from IPR News. We're back with more of River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer. If you just tuned in, we're looking past the, you might say, calcified classroom myths of Lewis and Clark. I sure learned about them, was fascinated by them. We're talking today with historian Craig Fehrman about his new book, This Vast Enterprise, a beautifully researched chapter-by-chapter look at the unexpected people who held the Lewis and Clark expedition together some 220 years ago, including indigenous leaders, teenagers, and working-class soldiers. Craig, let's talk about the Iowa connection here. Early on in the expedition, moving up the Missouri, long before any of the drama out west, this expedition also buried a man in what's now Iowa. Tell us about Sergeant Charles Floyd and this idea of councils as part of the mission of this grand expedition.
Sure. Well, let's take the councils first, and then we can talk about Floyd, because that's kind of chronological. In 1804, when they're starting out, they've got a big barge. It's the size of a semi-truck trailer. So they're taking this up the Missouri River, going against the current, and they don't have steam engines. The only engine they have is just raw manpower. So York and the regular soldiers, they're rowing, they're towing, they're doing anything they can to make progress up the river, and eventually they get to where on one side it's what's now Iowa, and they're slowly making it up the Missouri. But, although the men were mostly just focused on making progress, Jefferson had bigger ideas in mind. And so Lewis and Clark had to implement those bigger ideas. And one was these diplomatic councils. They were supposed to meet with native leaders, talk with native leaders, sort of share, this is America's agenda, send native leaders all the way back to Washington, D.C. to meet with Jefferson. And this happened. Native leaders traveled thousands of miles east while Lewis and Clark were traveling thousands of miles west. So during this time, Lewis and Clark had their first council, and it was near Council Bluffs. So it was on a place called Council Bluff. It's technically a few miles away from what's Council Bluffs today, the actual city. But it was a very important meeting, and it was a nerve-wracking meeting because it was the first one. Lewis and Clark didn't quite know what to expect. So if it's all right, I'll read you another passage here about this kind of council and sort of the preparation for it.
Please do. Historian Craig Fehrman reading from this vast enterprise.
The next day, at sunset, a group of Otoe and Missouri leaders arrived at Council Bluff. Clark's anxiety began competing with his excitement. There were at least a dozen natives, including Big Horse, an Otoe leader, and He Who Pities Them, a Missouri one. The captains went to greet them, shaking hands and offering gifts of flour and pork. The natives answered with watermelons, a gift of their own. Every man on his guard, Clark wrote in his journal, ready for anything. The next morning, August 3rd, 1804, the men dug their dress uniforms out of their knapsacks. As an officer in the Army, Lewis wore a blue coat with a red collar and cuffs, embellished by silver buttons. Clark's commission was in the artillery, which meant his detailing was gold. The soldiers had transformed the barge's sail into a shady awning. Once the native leaders gathered under it, the captains ordered their men to parade. The Americans formed in close order and marched with practiced precision. The Otoe and Missouri watched politely. They thought the soldiers looked like Shadani, blue jays.
Interesting. And there are many more councils that you recount in this book here, too. So let's jump to talk about Sergeant Charles Floyd. Historical accounts describing him as the expedition's quartermaster, the only fatality of the expedition. There were many who died connected with this expedition, but he died in August of 1804. Tell us how he died and perhaps read an account of him from your book.
Sure. Well, he probably died of appendicitis. We have to do a little inference and guesswork here because we have the journals, but they don't necessarily tell us everything about every situation. But it seems pretty clear that he had a problem with his appendix, he had got an infection, and he died. And so this is not, Lewis and Clark didn't do anything wrong. If he had been with the best doctor in America at that time period, he still would have passed away. But it was still a heartbreaking moment, and it was still early on. We're still in this first year, 1804. We're still around Iowa. The kind of memorial to Floyd is in Sioux City today, so it's still right here in the early steps of the expedition. And one thing I'll say before I write this is that this comes in a York chapter. So you mentioned the rotating points of view. I think one way I could make the expedition feel new is, any book you read about the expedition, that Charles Floyd is going to die in it. That's a huge moment. But I was able to look at this moment from York's point of view. And there are moments in the journals where Clark records Floyd's final words, which is a very heartbreaking and human moment. But, you can talk about that the way Clark saw it, or you can talk about that the way York saw it. I tried to, give York center stage during some of these moments, too. So here's Floyd's sickness. On August 19th, 1804, Floyd became suddenly and violently ill. His appendix had probably ruptured, leading to infection. York stayed up all night with the sick sergeant. He fed him and cleaned his vomit. Perhaps he tried to comfort him with stories of their shared Kentucky home. The next morning, the party proceeded while York sat with Floyd on the barge. They stopped for lunch around noon, and York listened as Floyd said, "I am going away." Then he died. The Corps was stunned. They returned to the river for about a mile, stopping at the first high hill, which they named Floyd's Bluff. They built some kind of coffin, and the soldiers donned their dress uniforms. They carried Floyd to the top of his hill. "We buried him," wrote Ordway, "with the honors of war." Lewis delivered the service. Clark said Floyd was our deceased brother. The men grieved, but they also reflected. Patrick Gass called Floyd, quote, the first man who had fallen in this important expedition. No one believed he would be the last.
Craig Fehrman reading from this vast enterprise. Yeah, and now so that our listeners passing that monument or visiting that monument or that bluff now have a detail of how Sergeant Floyd died there. This is one of the points in your book, Craig, where, I know where it is. As you get further out west, I have to think you deliberately refrain from using like phrases again and again, present day, present day, wherever, in this book. And I wonder why you did that. Was it to keep the reader really in the past and stop you from saying, okay, now this interstate runs by this part?
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I did think a lot about this, and I actually, as different editors read it, a couple of them said, I think that it would be better to have those modern day markers. But in the end, we decided not to, and it's because the goal of this book is really immersion. This is not a book about 2026. This is a book about 1804. And I think you can feel this idea even in the Floyd passage we talked about. Obviously we know how the Lewis and Clark expedition ends, but when you're reading a book, hopefully a good book can cast a spell. So that idea when Gass, one of the soldiers, called Floyd the first person to die, like even in that phrase, you can see that Gass is thinking he's not the last person to die. In the fall of 1804, there were about 30 of these soldiers, and they assumed a lot of them were going to die. They knew that they were doing something extremely dangerous. So, you can tell the Lewis and Clark story and just start with only one man died. You can start with they crossed into what will become Montana. Or you can do it a different way, which is what I tried to do. You can try to cast the spell and make people feel like they are in the canoe next to Lewis and Clark and York, that they are stressed, that they don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. That's what the expedition was like emotionally for them, and I really tried to capture that anxiety in my book.
I don't know if you had this reaction. I certainly did, and you described it as like this barge was huge, and you're going against the current up the Missouri. I just can't imagine this. It makes me think that I know there are adventurers, people who climb Everest and do amazing feats today, but so many of us can't even imagine the physical qualities and the mental qualities necessary to be part of this expedition.
It's really incredible what they had to do every day, and then they had to get it up and do it the next day. Just the grueling nature of it was astonishing. During one point where they had to cross by land, they had to drag their boats across land. It was so hard that the men would fall asleep during the middle of the day. Lewis and Clark would stop for a break, and they would look around, and their soldiers at 11 o'clock in the day were asleep because they were just so tired. Their bodies were so worn down. But then they had to interrupt the cat nap and keep going because that's just what the job was. The fact that they did this again and again, they were eating 5,000, 6,000 calories a day because they had to just to keep moving.
Let's talk about a name that most all of us know from, let's go back to elementary school, if not junior high, Sacagawea. You reconsider her profile in this book, and you attribute, I think, 2 full chapters to her point of view. What did 2 chapters from her perspective let you do that hasn't been done in conventional biographies or accounts of her role in this expedition? It's remarkable. She's 15, 16 years old here, and also pregnant and then carrying a baby. So remarkable.
She is one of those people where the reality lives up to the myth, which as a historian, when you find those kind of people, it's really fun. But I will say that kind of the grade school version of Sacagawea is that she was this cheerful helper. She was always ready to, point out a plant to Lewis or help Clark with the navigation. And that's true. But I think that to better appreciate and understand what she was up to, you have to look at her life before. And so that's something I did really carefully in my book. People say, Sacagawea was a wife, she was a mother, but I don't think that's the right word. The word for her is that she was a slave. And I want to be clear, this is not me imposing some 2026 idea on the past. William Clark used this word. He described her as a slave. And historians have done a lot of research about how Native women were enslaved by fur traders in this time period. And so Sacagawea grew up with the Shoshone, was kidnapped and enslaved, and ended up being owned by this fur trader named Charbonneau. And her life was incredibly dark. I understand why we can't talk about this complete version in elementary school, but this is a book for adults, so we can talk about the fact that she was sexually abused, that her owner beat her, that he impregnated her, all like you said, while she was 15 or 16 years old. But if you understand this darkness, I think that recasts the sort of helpful tour guide part of her life that we do know. Because every time Sacagawea was friendly to Lewis and Clark, she was also being strategic. She realized, I can trust these guys, I can make myself valuable to them, and then they will take care of me. And that's exactly what happened. There's a moment on the expedition when Charbonneau, Sacagawea's owner, starts beating her. And Clark steps in and says, you can't do that here. And that's a moment that tells us something about Clark and something positive about Clark, but I believe it also tells us something about Sacagawea. It tells us that she was strategic, that she realized if I can make an alliance, I can protect myself and my newborn baby, and I can make it home to my people. She was able to do that. It's just one of the great stories, honestly, in global history. It's incredible.
And the context here important that I don't know if surprise is too strong a word, but we have a romantic view sometimes of Native American tribes. You talked about enslavement. Tribes enslaved each other's after wars or battles. Enslavement was common here, and that it was just normal.
That's right. And again, it's very important to kind of put us in the 1804 perspective. So in the book, I try to trace some of these nuances. When Sacagawea was enslaved by the Hidatsa people at first, there could be a happy ending to that story. She could slowly, through the idea of kinship, sort of form alliances, and she might never be fully free, but her children could be fully free. That was something that happened in native enslavement. But what happened for Sacagawea, unfortunately, is that the native people who enslaved her then sold or traded her to a fur trader named Charbonneau, and that version of slavery is much darker and much more like the kind of slavery we think of with Clark and York. So even with an idea like slavery, it looks different from different perspectives, from different nations. I did that again and again in this book. You find these big moments, whether it's the expedition or the idea of being owned by somebody else, and when you look at it from different perspectives, it takes on a whole new meaning, and you can see a whole new layer of humanity that was missed before.
Craig, we have about 5 minutes before we go to break. I want to get to Black Buffalo and how this book, I think in your words, completely upends our understanding of Lakota American diplomacy. We talked about the first council there, but through Black Buffalo's eyes, when you recount this diplomacy, what have we gotten wrong in previous accounts, according to your view?
Well, I think most people think about these diplomatic meetings that Lewis and Clark had from the American point of view. What did Thomas Jefferson want? How did this connect to the Louisiana Purchase? And that passage I read earlier, that's from a Clark chapter, so it's very much operating in that view. But when we get to Lewis and Clark meeting with the Lakota, and they had a very tense 4-day encounter with them on the Missouri, I move the camera around, and so we talk about it from Black Buffalo's point of view. And I think what's important to say is that Black Buffalo was trying to use the Americans. It's very easy for us to say, well, Lewis and Clark had an agenda and they were trying to use the Lakota to achieve it. But Black Buffalo and the Lakota had an agenda too. They were trying to use Lewis and Clark. And honestly, the person that Black Buffalo was most worried about, and we know this from reading the journals carefully or looking at these things called winter counts, the person that Black Buffalo was worried about wasn't Lewis or Clark. It was a guy named the Partisan, who was a different Lakota leader. There was a big rivalry within the Southern Lakota that predated Lewis and Clark. And when Lewis and Clark showed up, both sides of this Lakota debate were thinking, how can we use these outsiders to achieve our goals?
Yeah, and so this is really interesting, this standoff that nearly turns violent, and you use the chapter to sort of reframe this encounter as a sophisticated Lakota diplomacy rather than just merely obstruction, which earlier many accounts put it as just being, they're just being obstructive, right?
Well, yeah, that's how Lewis and Clark saw it. They were frustrated. Lewis and Clark were like, we need to keep going, and these people are trying to stop us and take our goods. But, from the Lakota perspective, the nations that were to the north of them, people like the Arikara, they were enemies of the Lakota. And so when Lewis and Clark showed up, from Black Buffalo's point of view, if he lets Lewis and Clark keep going, who's to say Lewis and Clark aren't going to give a bunch of guns and bullets to the Arikara, guns and bullets that will then be turned on the Lakota themselves? So if you see this from the Lakota point of view, Black Buffalo wasn't obstructing just to obstruct. He was being very rational and trying to take care of his people. Lewis and Clark were patriots who loved America, but Black Buffalo was a patriot who loved the Lakota too. And that clash between two rational and complicated and passionate human beings, that doesn't just make better history, that makes a better story too.
Start us off on this this college notebook of Clark, and we'll continue after the break. Apparently been sitting there for anyone to find, recently uncovered by another researcher at the Missouri Historical Society. Briefly, what does this discovery do to your project that's already underway, that when you got a hold of it?
Yeah, well, the key was actually an unpublished autobiography I found from a Clark family friend, and I remember I was just reading this autobiography to try to learn something about York, and then a William Clark shows up, and I'm like, wait, is it that William Clark? And so I do a couple steps to verify it, and it is. And so this autobiography told us that Clark went to college, which made that notebook make sense in a new way. And the big takeaway, I think, is that Clark was a serious Enlightenment thinker. It's very easy to see him as like the captain who's the Kentuckian. He's good with the soldiers. He's good with the men. But Clark cared about big ideas. And again, especially in this early part in Iowa, he is going out on side missions, trying to learn about Native people. He's very curious. He's probably more curious than Lewis. And Clark cared about these big ideas and understanding Native history and Native culture in a way that was very cutting edge for its time.
Right, and so you reveal him as a serious student of the Enlightenment, rather than sort of the counterpart to Lewis, a folksy and bad spelling Kentuckian that we grew up with, sort of.
That's right. I mean, Clark was a bad speller. There's no question about that, but he was still a smart guy. A lot of people were bad spellers. And so I think what the notebook allowed me to do is show that Clark was more complicated than we realize. And that's what I tried to do with everybody in this book, to try to find the facets. Because, human beings have so many sides to them. That's true of York. That's true of Clark, too.
Okay, we have to take another break. We'll be back with more of my conversation with Craig Fehrman, author of This Vast Enterprise, a groundbreaking new history of the Lewis and Clark expedition, told from 10 different points of view. Certainly something to check out. They rotate through these chapters. When we come back, I want to talk about something else here, a long buried account of a deadly clash that someone named Wolf Calf, a Blackfoot teenager, had. In just a moment, it's River to River from IPR News. Back with more River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer. My guest this hour, journalist and historian Craig Fehrman, talking about his best-selling new book, This Vast Enterprise, reconstructing this famous American journey through the eyes of forgotten figures who actually made it possible. Everyone from an enslaved servant, York, to a working-class soldier, Ordway, who fought off grizzlies. Let's talk about Ordway before we talk about Wolf Calf, because Ordway is someone we definitely do not know, Craig. Most of us. One of your favorite figures in this book. Why?
Well, he's just... He has such an American sensibility where he just needs to do the work. He doesn't have a lot of time for talking. He doesn't have a lot of time for diplomacy. He knows that his job is to make that barge move a few miles every day, and so he does that job. But he's also trapped in such an interesting human situation because he's a sergeant. He's a non-commissioned officer. So the regular soldiers under Lewis and Clark, I mean, I'm not going to criticize them from our air-conditioned viewpoint because they were doing such hard things, but they were kind of troublemakers. They like to get into the whiskey supplies when they weren't supposed to. They could cause some trouble. And so Ordway was kind of the buffer. He had to implement the captain's orders, but then keep the men who were complaining from complaining to the captains. He was sort of classically caught in the middle, but then he also had to splash to the river and do the hard work. And Lewis and Clark were elites. They were officers. Clark went to college, like we said. So they were doing scientific and political things. They were very rarely the ones doing the backbreaking work to make the boat move. And these soldiers, they would tow their barge or later their canoes against the current. One time, one of the soldiers reached forward and tried to grab a bush, and he pulled out a rattlesnake instead. So, I mean, could you just imagine that? A rattlesnake in your hand? Thankfully, the soldier moved quickly enough to throw it away before he got bit. But that's the kind of thing that John Ordway and his soldiers had to deal with every single day. But they did it, and Ordway was just such a hardworking guy, and he really, he was the one who was doing the physical parts of the expedition. You can't understand Lewis and Clark unless you understand John Ordway's part of it too.
Right, and to mention that for you as a historian, so important that Ordway, wasn't he the only member of the Corps who wrote a journal entry every single day of the trip? This is a 2-year expedition, and he does all these demanding things and then finds time and the discipline to make a journal entry every day.
That's right. That just speaks to his discipline and his sense of duty. One of my favorite moments in the expedition is that one of the men shoots a bald eagle, which was not quite as symbolic back then as it was today. But I really think John Ordway had the most American response to this. He walked over to the bald eagle, he plucked out some feathers because he knew he needed more quill pens to do his duty, to keep writing in that journal. That's John Ordway right there. What's my job? I'm going to do it.
Okay, let's talk about Wolf Calf. And this is perhaps the most explosive chapter toward the end of the book. He is a Blackfoot teenager, and a master equestrian present at the deadly 1806. Now we're jumping forward here from what most of our discussion has centered on. This is a clash with Lewis's men on the Marias River. Wolfcalf loses a friend in it. Set this up, because I'd like you to do a reading here as well.
Sure. Well, this is a really important moment, like the Lakota moment. It's one of the two times where Lewis and Clark's interaction with Native people threatened to turn violent. In this case, it does turn violent. But again, this is a moment where I would just move the camera to try to find something new to bring to this story. But in this case, I'm not just bringing a new perspective. I'm bringing new documents, because as I was doing my work, I found this transcript in an old notebook dating back to the 1890s where Wolfcalf talked about in real time, this is what the encounter meant to me. And so to set this up, this is just Lewis by himself and a couple soldiers. They're off on kind of a side mission trying to check off something for Jefferson in terms of his kind of geopolitical desires for the expedition. And so they run into some Blackfoot people who are on their way back from a horse raid. And horse raids are very important to understand the Great Plains in this time period. They very rarely turned violent. The idea was you take a couple horses, you disappear, the person you raided never even knows who hit them. They just know that they've lost their horses. And of course, horses are really important, especially if you're a young person like Wolfcalf, because that's how you build your wealth and you build your name and your community. So on the first day, Lewis and Wolfcalf and the Blackfoot people and the American soldiers, they kind of sit around a fire, they smoke a pipe together. Lewis sort of says, this is why we're here, this is what we want, and everybody goes to sleep. But then the raid starts the next morning at dawn, and this has always been portrayed from Lewis's point of view, where the Blackfoot people tried to take the American guns. But once I read Wolfcalf's interview, I started to see some different things, not just in his version of things, but in Lewis's version too. So I'd be happy to read you a little bit from this raid if you'd like.
Please do. Craig Fehrman reading from This Vast Enterprise.
Like most Blackfoot raids, this one began at dawn. It was July 27th, 1805, and the rain had finally stopped. According to Wolfcalf, 3 Pawnee is like a division of the Blackfoot, 3 Pawnee edged away from the campsite, hoping to secure 3 American horses. Sidehill Calf, he's kind of the adult who led the Blackfoot side. Sidehill Calf's plan was probably to add 3 horses to their herd and then leave quietly. The Pawnee had not yet gathered their weapons and supplies. Joseph Field, the American soldier, was on watch and doing a bad job of it. He would later admit that he'd left his rifle on the ground. He may have been drowsing. According to Wolfcalf, Field saw or heard the missing horses. He began to yell, waking his brother Reuben by the fire. The Pawnee scattered, except for Sidehill Calf. He thought he could defuse the situation. It was just a botched horse raid. They'd spent hours together the night before, talking about peace. When he saw the Field brothers running toward him, when he saw the fury twisting their faces, Sidehill Calf realized that peace was not an option. He turned to run, but Reuben caught him and drove a knife deep into his chest. Wolfcalf watched this happen. So did Sidehill Calf's son. Perhaps one of the Blackfoot yelled a new order. Perhaps their shared rage drove them in the same direction. Either way, the plan switched from stealing horses to stealing guns. It was now, in Wolfcalf's words, a battle.
Mm-hmm. Riveting there. Now, I understand this Wolfcalf interview that is new in the discovery of this sort of a historical discovery, the most exciting discovery of the whole project for you. How did you find it?
Well, it started with these letters from about 1903. There was a guy named George Bird Grinnell who was friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and like Teddy Roosevelt, he kind of had his hands in everything. So he was an important conservationist from today's perspective, but he also went to native reservations and interviewed native people. So in a letter, Grinnell said, I talked to this guy named Wolfcalf who ran into Lewis and Clark, and here's what I remember he said. And in his letter, Grinnell said, I think I have more in my notebook. I'll go back and check. Now, historians have worked with this letter for a long time, but nobody, including Grinnell, ever went back to check the notebook. So that's what I did. I was like, well, maybe this notebook is out here, and I found the notebook, and I found Wolfcalf's transcript in it. And what's so interesting is that Wolfcalf's transcript is different than Grinnell's memory of it. So we have Grinnell writing this letter more than a decade later. That's what historians have worked off of. But to have Wolfcalf's actual words written in real time, as close to verbatim as possible, and you can see this in Grinnell's handwriting. His handwriting is very cramped because he, like any good journalist, is trying to get every single word down. So when we look at what Wolfcalf actually said, Grinnell's version is the Blackfoot people wanted to steal the guns. They did not try to do peace. It escalated. Wolfcalf's version is different. Wolfcalf's version says all we wanted were horses. And when the Americans realized what was happening, Side-Hill Calf tried to de-escalate. He tried to have peace, and instead the Americans killed him. That version lines up much more closely with the best scholarship on this. People like John Ewers, who worked at the Smithsonian for decades, he wrote a classic book about the Blackfoot horse raid. His scholarship lines up with Wolfcalf's version, not the American version. And the other key thing here is that when I read Wolfcalf's version, it caused me to look at Lewis's journal entries differently, because I went back to Lewis's journal entries, and what I realized was that all these details from the American point of view, Lewis wasn't even there to see them. Lewis was asleep. So what we come down to is not Lewis versus Wolfcalf. It's Wolfcalf's word versus the Field brothers' words. The same Field brothers who fell asleep on watch and who killed a native person. So this really becomes a he said thing. And I want to be clear. I understand that different people can interpret it different ways. So there's an appendix in my book where I just reprint Wolfcalf's interview and I reprint Lewis's journal entry. My kids at school, their teachers are always saying, show your work. Well, I kind of think historians should do that too. So if you get my book and look in the appendix, you can see these competing versions, and you as the reader can sort of see this is exactly why Craig made this decision. Maybe I agree with him, maybe I don't. But either way, I think it's really important to bring these sources out and sort of show our methods and how much work goes into reinterpreting a huge moment like this.
You, in fact, dedicate a full appendix to defending your own methodology before critics even raised questions. Talk about that. Did you, for instance, know going in that this structure, these rotating viewpoints, and putting so much weight on non-traditional, sometimes under-documented points of view was going to invite scrutiny? And certainly did, I have to imagine.
There's been some people who have asked questions, and I fully understand that. And honestly, I embrace that. History's supposed to be a conversation. When I said that Wolfcalf's view helped me reconsider Lewis's view, that's how it should work. It's not oral text versus written text. It's all the text coming together, and then historians doing their best possible job to get at the truth. But I understood that people are going to have different interpretations, and there's a lot of new stuff in my book. That's why I spent 5 years on it. But I also tried to show my work and to sort of show people that I took this seriously. This book has more than 40,000 words of endnotes. It's, if you compare it to lots of other quote unquote dad history books, you'll see that this one has a lot more endnotes. It's a very serious work. I respect scholars, and I tried to make new scholarly contributions myself. But I also hope that this is kind of the start of a conversation and a continuing conversation. I just think it's really important to bring both points of view in. And the thing that I will say is that, this is not a modern decision. When Jefferson talked about the Lakota, he said that the Americans in this area were, quote, miserably weak. So this idea that this was always a story with two sides, that the Americans were worried about Native people just as much as Native people were worried about the Americans, that's the 1804 version of reality. That's how the world felt to Lewis and Clark and Wolfcalf. And so that's why this book, I think, is more accurate, because it recaptures the fact that this was always a two-way dynamic.
In the final 5 minutes of our conversation, Craig, I'd like to have us, well, really, in reading this book, I felt like I was time traveling back there. I was so immersed in each scenario that you write about here. But let's do it as much as we can for real. And I want to ask you to step back and witness a moment from this whole story in person. If you could do that and not be endangered yourself, where would you go? What these hundreds of scenes, where would you choose to land, do you think?
I think I would pick to go to a boring winter day at Fort Mandan. This is in what's now North Dakota, but the reason I would pick this is that it captures what I think makes Lewis and Clark such a great story and such an all-American story. Because on one of those boring days, you would have some Native people coming to the fort to trade. You would have the soldiers kind of bored and ready to go and sort of trying to work out their interpersonal dynamics. You would have York there. You would have Sacagawea there. Maybe she's just given birth. Maybe she's 8 months pregnant. You would have Lewis and Clark there. And the fact that this one expedition brought together so many different people from so many different ways of life, that's what's so fascinating about it. So we have the journals, we have our interpretations of the journals, but there are always things that we wish we could know more. So to just watch them sit around and maybe have a dinner while it's 30 degrees below outside, and they joke and they talk and they just be human beings together, that's what I would love to see and love to hear.
Mm-hmm. In that scene, a follow-up there, in that scene, is there a figure there in the scene you described that you'd like to ask a question of, something that's unanswered in that setting in North Dakota? What would you ask? What would you want to find out or nail down and say, it could have been this way or this way? What would you want to know?
Well, we've talked a lot about people who are not Lewis and Clark, but this book still has a lot about Lewis and Clark in it. And so I think I would actually want to talk to Lewis a little bit. And I would want to ask him, what did he make of York and what did he make of Clark bringing York along? Because this was kind of a surprise to Lewis. And I found new documents that I think suggest really strongly that Lewis had a much different view of slavery than Clark did. That, I'm not saying Lewis was an abolitionist, but Lewis had a real distaste for slavery. And so, we think of Lewis and Clark as this great team, and they certainly were. But they had to disagree. I mean, you can't really have a best friend if you don't disagree with them, right? That's sort of the definition of if you can't disagree with them, they're probably not your best friend in the first place. So I wonder, did Lewis and Clark ever talk about slavery? Did they talk about York coming along on the expedition? We know there's a letter from after the expedition where Clark says he wanted to beat York and punish York, and Lewis said, I don't think you should do that. So Clark didn't. So there are these hints that their relationship was complicated in a way that they were never going to put in the journals. I would love to ask Lewis about this dynamic and what he really thought.
In the 2 minutes we have remaining, Craig, perhaps we can linger a little bit on Lewis because we've ignored him this entire conversation. We've ignored a lot of fascinating things here, but Lewis has been a focal point, a centerpiece of so many narratives of this expedition. Say a few words about Lewis, the remarkable individual he was, and the end that he met here, a sad ending.
Well, this is another place where I found something new. When I started working on this book, I knew I had new points of view and sort of a new way to tell the story. But what surprised me again and again is how many new documents I found. And other than the wolf calf one, what I found about Lewis is probably the biggest thing in the book. When Lewis made it back from the expedition, he was a celebrity. Everybody wanted a piece of him. And one of the things he did was had dinner with John Quincy Adams, who they'd had dinner with before the expedition. And I found this new letter and a diary entry from John Quincy Adams, where John Quincy Adams describes this. Adams says, I knew Lewis, but when we sat down, I didn't even recognize this guy. He looked 15 years older. I think it's so interesting and humanizing to know that a 2-year expedition aged Lewis 15 years. I think that speaks to how hard the expedition was. I think that also reveals something about Lewis's own psychology, about how intense he was, which made him a great leader and observer, but also meant that he sort of carried the weight of things more difficultly than a lot of human beings would. So understanding Lewis and how he killed himself after the expedition, we're never going to have an easy ABC explanation for that. But John Quincy Adams' letter, I think, helps us start to understand what the expedition cost Lewis, what he sacrificed for his country.
This book has landed about as big as a history book can, I think, Craig, you will agree. New York Times bestseller, cover of the New York Times Book Review, praise from writers you've, I think, admired for years. What's that all been like? It must be just tremendously satisfying.
I mean, it crosses from satisfying into overwhelming. When my life slows down here a little bit, I think I'm just going to have a good cry because it's, you work 5 years on something like this and you don't know how it's going to go. You're just waking up every day and going to work. But the reception has been just so gratifying to me. But honestly, the thing I keep thinking about is people know who John Ordway is now. People understand how complicated York's life was now. And so Americans are always going to be interested in Lewis and Clark. That's one reason I wrote the book and was excited to write the book. It's a great story. But if my book in some small way can remind us that, there were more Americans involved in it and more Native people involved with it, that's what makes me the happiest, because that really makes it an all-American story. We just sent people on Artemis 2 to the moon. It wasn't just about the astronauts. It was about the engineers and the politicians and everybody who helped make that happen. That's what America does. We come together and achieve something together. The expedition was the exact same way. And so if I could help frame it that way, I mean, that's the honor of a career for me.
Craig Fehrman, this vast enterprise, his latest book, A New History of Lewis and Clark, 5 years, 30 archives, 100 interviews, and an expedition retold from 10 different points of view. Fascinating read. We've only touched on a few of the highlights in this conversation. Craig, thank you so much. It's been a delight to read your book and to have this conversation. Take care.
Hey, thank you so much.
Today's program produced by Samantha McIntosh. Our executive producer is Catherine Perkins. I'm Ben Kiefer. Thanks for joining us.